Her eyes were made of diamonds, Mrs. Vlivlid's. They flared when they looked at the moon, almost challenging, as if she were saying, "You shan't have him." And I felt like an outsider. The one who least understood all of this was my deaf cousin. When we helped him down, pulling him, as I explained to you, by his legs, Mrs. Vlivlid lost all her self-control, doing everything she could to take his weight against her own body, folding her long, silvery arms around him. I felt a pang in my heart the times I clung to her. Her body was soft and kind, but not thrust forward the way it was with my cousin, while he was indifferent, still lost in his lunar bliss. I looked at the captain, wondering if he also noticed his wife's behavior. There was never a trace of any expression on the face of his, eaten by brine, marked with periwinkles. Since the deaf one was always the last to break away from the moon, his return was a signal for the boats to move off. And then, with an unusually polite gesture, Vlivlid picked up the harp from the bottom of the boat and handed it to his wife. She was obliged to take it and play a few notes. Nothing could separate her more from the deaf one than the sound of the harp. I took to singing in a low voice, that sad song that goes, "Every shiny fish is floating, floating, and every dark fish is at the bottom of the sea." And all the others, except my cousin, echoed my words. Every month, once the satellite had moved on, the deaf one returned to his solitary detachment from the things of the world. Only the approach of the full moon aroused him again. That time I had arranged things so it wasn't my turn to go up. I could stay in the boat with the captain's wife. But then, as soon as my cousin had climbed the ladder, Mrs. Vlivlid said, "This time I want to go up there too." This had never happened before. The captain's wife had never gone up on the moon, but Vlivlid made no objection. In fact, he almost pushed her up the ladder bodily, exclaiming, "Go ahead then." And we all started helping her, and I held her from behind, felt her round, soft on my arms, and to hold her up, I began to press my face and the palms of my hands against her. And when I felt her rising into the moon's sphere, I was heartsick at the lost contact, so I started to rush after her, saying, "I'm going to go up for a while too to help out." I was held back as if in a vice. "You stay here. You have work to do later," the captain commanded, without raising his voice. At that moment, each one's intentions were already clear, and yet I couldn't figure things out. Even now, I'm not sure I've interpreted it correctly. Certainly, the captain's wife had for a long time been cherishing the desire to go off privately with my cousin up there, or at least to prevent him from going off alone with the moon. But probably she had a still more ambitious plan, one that would have to be carried out in agreement with the deaf one. She wanted the two of them to hide up there together and stay on the moon for a month. But perhaps my cousin, deaf as he was, hadn't understood anything of what she had tried to explain to him, or perhaps he hadn't even realized that he was the object of the lady's desires. And the captain, he wanted nothing better than to be rid of his wife. In fact, as soon as she was confined up there, we saw him give free rein to his inclinations and plunge into vice, and then we understood why he had done nothing to hold her back. But had he known from the beginning that the moon's orbit was widening, none of us could have suspected it. The deaf one perhaps, but only he. In the shadowy way he knew things, he may have had a presentiment that he could be forced to bid the moon farewell that night. That is why he hid in his secret places and reappeared only when it was time to come back down on board. It was no use for the captain's wife to try to follow him. We saw her cross the scaly zone various times, length and breadth, and suddenly she stopped, looking at us in the boat, as if about to ask whether we had seen him. Surely there was something strange about that night. The sea's surface, instead of being taut as it was during the full moon, or even arched a bit towards the sky, now seemed limp, sagging, as if the lunar magnet no longer exercised its full power. And the light, too, wasn't the same as the light of another full moon. The night shadows, somehow, to have thickened. Our friends up there must have realized that what was happening. In fact, they looked up at us with frightened eyes, and from their mouths and ours at the same moment came a cry. "The moon's going away!" The cry hadn't died out when my cousin appeared on the moon, running. He didn't seem frightened or even amazed. He placed his hands on the terrain, flinging himself into his usual somersault, but this time after he had hurled himself into the air, he remained suspended, as little Xylex had. He hovered a moment between moon and earth, upside down, then laboriously moving his arms like someone swimming against a current, he headed with unusual slowness towards our planet. From the moon, the other sailors hastened to follow his example. Nobody gave a thought to getting the moon milk that had been collected into the boats, nor did the captain scold them for this. They had already waited too long. The distance was too difficult to cross by now. When they tried to imitate my cousin's leap or his swimming, they remained there groping, suspended in midair. "Cling together, idiots! Cling together!" the captain yelled. At this command, the sailors tried to form a group, a mass, to push all together until they reached the zone of the Earth's attraction. All of a sudden, a cascade of bodies plunged into the sea with a loud splash. The boats were now rowing to pick them up. "Wait, the captain's wife is missing," I shouted. The captain's wife had also tried to jump, but she was still floating only a few yards from the moon, slowly moving her long silvery arms in the air. I climbed up on the ladder, and in a vain attempt to give her something to grasp, I held the harp out towards her. "I can't reach her. We have to go after her." I started to jump up, brandishing the harp. Above me, the enormous lunar disk no longer seemed the same as before. It had become much smaller. I swam furiously towards the sky and held the harp out to her, and instead of coming towards me, she rolled over and over, showing me first her impassive face and then her backside. "Hold tight to me," I shouted. I was already overtaking her, intertwining my limbs with hers. "If we cling together, we can go down." And I was concentrating all my strength on uniting myself more closely with her, and I concentrated my sensations as I enjoyed the fullness of that embrace. I was so absorbed I didn't realize at first that I was indeed tearing her from her weightless condition, but was making her fall back on the moon. Didn't I realize that? Or had that been my intention from the very beginning? Before I could think properly, a cry was already bursting from my throat. "I'll be the one to stay with you for a month, or rather, on you," I shouted in my excitement. On you for a month." And at that moment, our entrance was broken by our fall to the moon's surface, where we rolled away from each other among those cold scales. I raised my eyes, as I did every time. I touched the moon's crust, sure that I would see above me the native sea, like an endless ceiling. And I saw it. Yes, I saw it this time too, but much higher and much more narrow, bound by its borders of coast and cliffs and promontories. And how small the boats seemed, and how unfamiliar my friends' faces, and how weak their cries. A sound reached me from nearby. Mrs. Vlivlid had discovered her harp and was caressing it, sketching out a chord as sad as weeping. A long month began. The moon turned slowly around the earth. On the suspended globe, we no longer saw our familiar shore, but the passage of oceans as deep as abysses and deserts, glowing lapilli, and continents of ice, and forests writhing with reptiles, and the rocky walls of mountain chains, gashed by swift rivers, and swampy cities, and stone graveyards, and empires of clay and mud. The distance spread a uniform color over everything. The alien perspectives made every image alien. Herds of elephants and swarms of locusts ran over the plains, and evenly vast and dense and thickly grown, yet there was no difference among them. I should have been happy as I had dreamed. I was alone with her. That intimacy with the moon I had so often envied my cousin, and with Miss Vlivlid was now my exclusive prerogative. A month of days and lunar nights stretched uninterrupted before us. The crust of the satellite nourished us with its milk. whose tart flavor was familiar to us. We raised our eyes up to the world where we had been born, finally traversed in all its various expanse, explored landscapes no earth being had ever seen. Or else we contemplated the stars beyond the moon, biggest pieces of fruit, made of light, ripened on the curved branches of the sky, and everything exceeded my most luminous hopes, and yet it was, instead, exile. I thought only of the earth. It was the earth that caused each of us to be someone that he was rather than someone else. Up there, wrested from the earth, it was as if I were no longer that I, nor she that she, for me. I was eager to return to the earth, and I trembled at the fear of having lost it. The fulfillment of my dream of love had lasted only that instant when we had been united, spending between earth and moon, torn from its earthly soil. My love now knew only the heart-rending nostalgia for what it lacked, a where, a surrounding, a before and after. This is what I was feeling, but she, as I asked myself, I was torn by my fear, because if she also thought only of the earth, this could be a good sign, a sign that she had finally come to understand me. But it could also mean that everything had been useless, that her longings were directed still and only towards my deaf cousin. Instead, she felt nothing. She never raised her eyes to the old planet. She went off, pale among the wastelands, mumbling dirges and stroking her harp as if it completely identified with her temporary, as I thought, lunar state. Did this mean I had won out over my rival? No, I had lost, a hopeless defeat, because she had finally realized that my cousin loved only the moon, and the only thing she wanted now was to become the moon, to be assimilated into the object of that extra human love. When the moon had completed its circling of the planet, there we were again on the zinc cliffs. I recognized them with dismay. Not even in my darkest previsions had I thought the distance would have made them so tiny. In that mud puddle of the sea, my friends had set forth again, without the now useless ladders, but from the boats rose a kind of forest of long poles. Everyone was brandishing one, with a harpoon or a grappling hook at the end, perhaps in some hope of scraping off a last bit of moon melt, or of lending some kind of help to us wretches up there. But it was soon clear that no pole was long enough to reach the moon, and they dropped back, ridiculously short, humbled, floating on the sea, and in that confusion some of the boats were thrown off balance and overturned. But just then from another vessel a longer pole, which till then had been dragged along on the water's surface, began to rise. It must have been made out of bamboo, of many bamboo poles stuck one into the other, and to raise it they had to go slowly because thin as it was, if they let it sway too much it might break. Therefore they had to use it with great strength and skill, so that the wholly vertical weight wouldn't rock the boat. Suddenly it was clear that the tip of that pole would touch the moon, and we saw it graze, then press against the scaly terrain, rest there for a moment, give a kind of a little push, or rather a strong push that made it bounce off again, then come back and strike that same spot as if on the rebound, then move away once more. And I recognized, we both, the captain's wife and I, recognized my cousin. It couldn't have been anyone else. He was playing his last game with the moon, one of his tricks with the moon on the tip of his pole, as if he were juggling with it. And we realized that his virtuosity had no purpose, aimed at no practical result. Indeed, you would have said he was driving the moon away, and that he was helping her departure, and he wanted to show her to her more distant orbit. And this too was just like it. He was unable to conceive desires that went against the moon's nature, the moon's course and destiny, and if the moon now tended to go away from him, then he would take delight in this separation, just as till now he had delighted in the moon's nearness. What could Mrs. Vivid do in the face of this? It was only at this moment that she proved her passion for the deaf man hadn't been a frivolous whim, but an irrevocable vow. If what my cousin now loved was the distant moon, then she too would remain distant on the moon. I sensed this, seeing that she didn't take a step towards the bamboo pole, but simply turned her heart towards the earth, high in the sky, and plucked the strings. I say I saw her, but to tell the truth, I only caught a glimpse of her out of the corner of my eye, because the minute the pole had touched the lunar crust, I had sprung up and grasped it. And now, fast as a snake, I was climbing up the bamboo knots, pushing myself along with jerks of my arms and knees. A light in that rarefied space, driven by the natural power that ordered me to return to the earth, oblivious of the motive that had brought me up there, or perhaps more aware of it than ever, and of its unfortunate outcome. And already my climb up the swaying pole had reached a point where I no longer had to make any effort, but I could allow myself to slide head first, attracted by the earth, until in my haste the pole broke into 1,000 pieces, and I fell into the sea among the boats. My return was sweet, my home refound, but my thoughts were filled only with the grief at having lost her, and my eyes gazed at the moon, forever beyond my reach, as I sought her. And I saw her. She was there, where I had left her, lying on the beach directly over our heads, and she said nothing. She was the color of the moon. She held the harp at her side, and moved one hand now and then in slow arpeggios. I could distinguish the shape of her bosom, her arms, her thighs, just as I remembered them now, just as now when the moon had become that flat remote circle. And I still look for her as soon as the first sliver appears in the sky, and the more it waxes, the more clearly I imagine I can see her, or something of her, but only her, in 100,000 different vistas, she who makes the moon, and whenever she is full, sets the dogs to howling all night long, and me with them.